Good evening. Good to be with you again this evening. Glad that you are here. Tonight, we're going to be looking at Psalm 64, slowly making our way through the book of Psalms. And we'll be a few more years, but that's all right. It gives us something to look forward to together. This particular psalm, now that we are in, as we've talked about before, the second book of song, we always try to take a quick look at who the physical penman of this particular psalm was. And again, the Holy Spirit's the author, Second Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. So we know that is to be important. But most commentators and Bible historians believe that Psalm 64 is the penmanship of David. A matter of fact, in some Bibles, it'll even stay there before verse number 1, to the chief musician, a psalm of David. And so there is some pretty good evidence that David there is the particular writer, although the date and the occasion in which he penned this particular psalm is unknown, although it does appear to be a time in his life where he is troubled, as was often the case with David, it seemed like, where he's being troubled by enemies, whether it be from Saul, whether it be from Absalom, or whatever the case may be. Only 10 verses for this particular psalm, but there are certainly many lessons that can be learned. And so let's note the words of the psalmist. Hear my voice, O God, in my prayer. Preserve my life from fear of the enemy. Hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked, from the insurrection of the workers of iniquity, who whet their tongues like a sword and bend their bows to shoot their arrow, even bitter words, that they may shoot in secret at the perfect. Suddenly do they shoot at him and fear not. They encourage themselves in all evil matter. They consume of laying snares privily. They say, who shall see them? They search out iniquities. They accomplish a diligent search, both the inward thought of every one of them, and the heart is deep. But God shall shoot at them with an arrow. Suddenly shall they be wounded. So they shall make their own tongue to fall upon themselves. All that see them shall flee away. And all men shall fear and shall declare the work of God. For they shall wisely consider of his doings. The righteous shall be glad in the Lord and shall trust in him. And all the upright in heart shall glory. Through verse number 10. There are certainly many lessons that can be gleaned from this particular psalm. I think an overarching lesson that can be learned really throughout the entire psalm is that the righteous can find refuge in God. Notice how David there is describing the situation that he finds himself in. He talks about those workers of iniquity at the end there of verse number 2. At the beginning of verse number 2, he talks about how they're having secret counsel, the secret counsel of the wicked, those that are behind closed doors, that are sowing discourse, that are wanting trouble to abound. And he says that they're like, their tongue is like whetting a sword, ready to strike. Their words are like arrows. And notice he even describes their word, their bitter words. The tongue, James would go into great detail in James chapter number 3, really describing really the power of the tongue. Really, he describes it as the rudder of a ship, how such a small member can turn such a big thing. He talks about the bit in the horse's mouth, how such a small thing can make the horse go this way or the horse goes that way. And then, of course, he talks about how the little spark can kindle such a great fire. The tongue can get a man into a whole lot of trouble. And sometimes the words in which we use, if we're not careful, man, they're bitter. They're bitter. And we should not be like that. These individuals that were using these bitter words, they were those that were against God. A matter of fact, they were so far against God. They were so against him that in verse number 4, it says that they start to shoot in secret at the perfect. And so they're behind the back. They're cunning. They're subtle. We've heard that word, Genesis chapter number 3. There in verse number 1, the serpent was more subtle any creature. But here it is, this person starts out subtle. They're behind back sowing discord. Well, do you think God could do this? Or do you think God could really do that? They plant these things, and the next thing you know, they're in your face saying, well, God doesn't really exist. God's not really this. They start to do things towards God to where they do not fear Him. They encourage themselves in evil. They continue laying these things in private, and then they even ask, who shall see them? Who's going to see the traps that we lay? Who's going to who's going to be bothered by these things? Well, the answer, of course, is God. Because in verse number 7, you really see a change in the tone of the psalm. Because now God is going to be there with the righteous. A righteous individual, a Christian, should always remember 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse number 12. There, Paul writing to Timothy, he says, all those who desire, who will live godly, guess what's going to happen? They shall suffer persecution. If we're living a righteous life, God guarantees that we're going to be persecuted. And so those that were persecuting David are now, just for a play on of words, are now going to be persecuted by God, because God is going to shoot at them with an arrow, and it says suddenly they shall be wounded. They're going to fall upon themselves. They're going to flee away, because all men, verse number 9, they should fear God. You remember Solomon as he would close out that book of Ecclesiastes, after Solomon says, listen, I've tried it all. I've tried to find out what the purpose of man was. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter, to fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole of man. It is man's entire being to fear God. We just had a great gospel meeting on fearing God. Fear God and keep His commandments. But not only should all men fear God, I think the end of verse number 19 is very interesting. For they shall wisely consider of His doings. It is wise for you and I to consider the ways of God. You know, it's an interesting study when you go and you look through the Old Testament, you look through the New Testament. Anytime that God calls someone a fool, it's never a good thing. But here we have God saying they'll be wise if they consider His doings. It's wise if we consider the doings of God, if we consider His will. And when one does that, they are righteous, they shall be glad in the Lord, and they shall trust in Him. Because at the end of the day, we can put our faith, we can put in our trust in God. You know, the Hebrew writer says that He will never leave us nor forsake us. Peter would write that we can cast all our burdens on Him, for He careth for us. Jesus Himself would even say in Matthew chapter number 11, come all to me, come. Let me turn over there. Matthew chapter 11, Jesus can say it a whole lot better than I can try to quote it, that's for sure. Matthew chapter 11, verse number 28 and following. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest of my souls. Do you see what Jesus is saying? Verse number 30, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. We want to make sure that we extend the Lord's invitation to you. It could be the very case this evening that you have those that are trying to discourage you, those that are encouraging you to do wrong, those that have laid snares for you. Don't worry about those things. Trust in the Lord. Trust in Him with all your heart. Lean on Him. Lean on His understanding. Don't trust in yourself. And so if you're here this evening, you are a child of God, but you're dealing with some things, temptation, sin, persecution, whatever that is, let us know. We'll be happy to pray with you. We'll be happy to pray for you for those things that are going on in your life. Maybe there's someone that is watching this on YouTube that you're not a member of the Lord's church. you haven't yet obeyed the gospel of Christ, we would love to sit down and study with you to show you from this thing, from this book, what an individual has to do to be righteous in the eyes of God. So if you're here this evening and you're subject to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to come forward as together we stand and we sing.